welcome back, everyone, to our eighth and final module in our series on forecasts and budgets. Forecasting and budgeting is as much art as it is science. For those of you that have been involved in creating forecasts and budgets before, you may find it a simple, easy, quick process, and you might find it very frustrating and of very little value. It will depend very much on your experience. And it's important as we get into this to recognize the fact that many organizations use the term forecast, budget, estimate as if they mean the same things. And in finance, it's very important to recognize these are not the same tools. A forecast has a very different definition in accounting than a budget does. An estimate is more a generic term used in forecasting. So for our purposes in this module, we're going to use the financial approach when we define a forecast versus a budget. So a forecast is a calculated estimate of future values based on assumptions put into models. There are at least 18 different models, some qualitative, some quantitative, that we could use to make a forecast that we are comfortable with. A forecast is a tool that we should always use before we create a budget. It's where we get to test our assumptions, test alternative, test different scenarios, test different sensitivities before we make a commitment. If we forecast first, it helps us create a budget that we can have high confidence in, that we can achieve. And that's the proper approach. So we'll start with a forecast. We use one or more models that we have confidence in and most likely we've used before. We probably will base at least some of it on our own historical data, on what is currently happening in our industry, with our suppliers, with our customers, with the economy. We'll use it to project what could, should, might happen. We have to be very careful to remember, we don't just throw numbers into the model. We're going to create a series of assumptions, then we're going to validate or test those assumptions as much as we need to be comfortable that they are the most reasonable assumptions to put into our model. Now, you may have recognized I didn't use the word conservative. I said reasonable. And the reason for this is there's no practical reason to be overly conservative on our numbers. We need to be practical on our numbers. We need to validate, test our assumptions. If we test them and they're aggressive and we're comfortable with those, great. That's what goes in there. To be overly conservative without justification means in many cases we're not allowing our organization to grow as much as it might. If there's reason to be conservative in building out the forecast, then we should be. But if we are in a rapid growth industry, if we happen to be in a rapidly growing market, if we have new products and services that are going to drive the organization, why on earth would we put overly conservative numbers into our forecast? During my banking days, I can't even count the number of customers that came in with their financial projections, and the first thing they said was, well, these numbers are conservative. Even if they didn't need to be. Even if clearly when I looked at them, they weren't. But it seems to be a defensive justification that many people use, particularly with their banker. We don't want to do that. We want the forecast to be as practical, as reasonable as we can make them. Because once we create an initial forecast, part of the benefit of the tool of forecasting is to choose different alternatives. It's to play the what-if game. What if the cost of one of our main products goes up by 3%, down by 2%? What if we land 2 new major customers? What if we lose one territory? That's what forecasting is for, is to allow us to run a variety of different scenarios to determine the highest likelihood or probability of achieving the forecast. Once we have a high degree of confidence that this forecast is where we're going to take the organization, that's when we convert the forecast into a budget. Forecasts have no accountability for their basic purpose. It's to help us make a decision. When we convert it into a budget, that's when we've committed resources to it to achieve it in a specific period of time. And that's the basic difference. We always forecast before we budget. After we budget, then we're going to implement that budget. Then we're going to test it or compare it to itself. Are we achieving in each period what we projected that we would? If we are, we keep operating. If we're not, then what changes, what adjustments do we need to make to our operations? That's what our variance analysis is all about. Variance analysis is applied periodically against our budget to see where we're on track, where we're off track, to determine what actions we're going to take to achieve our long-term goals. So let's break forecasting models down into the 2 different areas, the 2 different types. The qualitative forecasts, these are judgment forecasts. These are forecasting things that are too difficult to measure, such as consumer desire for a particular color of an automobile. The major auto dealers in the world don't look at numbers to determine what color of flaming red metallic they're going to use on a particular car. Even though white cars, silver cars, and black cars always have sold best, you can clearly see that there's many other colors, and the names for the colors clearly are developed by people who used to write Hallmark cards, because they are truly one of the most creative things I've ever seen in the auto industry. It doesn't come from any financial model. It comes from judgment. And qualitative measures, qualitative forecasts, are very frequently used for these types of things. There's many different types of qualitative forecasts. It's either we don't have time to gather the data, or we don't have information available because it's something too new or too different. There's a lot of different reasons. So we typically use these models in those situations. We have a situation, pull a qualitative model like a consumer panel or sales force or experts, lay out the case, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, have it discussed, have the group give us the answer that they think is best. We take action. We're not going to make a commitment on a 25-year, $100 million project based on a qualitative forecast. But should we hire person A or person B, we will. So that's when we use the qualitative forecasting tools. Most of the time, we're going to use quantitative tools. These are based on numbers, and most of us are used to using quantitative tools to make our forecast. There's very simple tools like moving averages, trends, etc. And there's much more technical, much more statistically oriented quantitative models. They really fall into 2 different camps, if you will. There's the ones that use historical data, look for trends, make adjustments for seasonality and random variables, etc. And then there's the ones that use specific data and other statistics. The quantitative models clearly are more numbers oriented. They are, for many people, much more comfortable than qualitative. Sometimes they're more accurate, Sometimes they're not. And if you use something like a Monte Carlo simulation, which has as a main driver in that forecasting tool a random variable, every time you run that model, if you put your data in now and ran it this minute, changed one of your inputs and ran it again 10 seconds later, you're going to get two different outcomes. If you run it 100 times in the next 100 minutes, you will get 100 different results. So how can it be reliable? With a forecast, we're not trying to predict with 100% certainty what the future is. We're looking at the most likely range of outcomes. That's one of the misunderstood elements of forecast. Just like a budget, I have never seen a budget that has been achieved 100%. Why? There's simply too many things that happen, too many variables, too many surprises in the marketplace. We're trying to get reasonably close. We're not trying to get 100% accurate.